Now this is part 2 of our O-gauge layout build. On part 1 we built the table and laid out 2 loops of track just so we could run some trains. On this video I'm going to show putting together all of the switches, the track work, basically getting used to running the Mike's Train House system, and the biggest part, the tunnels, which were very time consuming, and how I made them out of styrofoam, and basically some of the basic scenery and how some of it changed over the years. Now the layout right now as I make this video is 26 years old, and of course at the end of it we'll show a few minutes of the final layout with all the modern trains running, but this is how we built the layout. Now one of my goals right from the beginning was to make this layout a lot more realistic than previous layouts that I had, and some of the times that I did that, halfway through the layout I realized, oh, I took a shortcut that came back to bite me. So on this construction project, I wanted to make sure that the track work was exactly how I wanted it. It's Gargrave's Phantom rail, Ross switches, and Ross crossover. And I wanted to have a crossover just so there'd be a lot of action in the final layout when I was running trains. And I laid this out and changed it so many times from my original sketches that it doesn't even pay to go back and look at it. I changed the whole layout part that went into the dormer, and this part up here where the switches and the crossover are. And I wanted to make sure before I even started the mountains or the scenery that I had every detail of the track work, all the wiring, all the switches were working with the air controls. And I know in the past when I had built layouts, I kind of skimped on this and I was anxious to get on with the scenery, but I wanted to make sure this part was perfect. Now I wanted to make sure all the engines I had no clearance issues anywhere, including and most of all inside the tunnels. And this was something that when you lay out a layout on pencil and paper, you don't really get a good view of it. But I wanted to see in real life, and I ran the trains through all the portals, looking from above at all the internal parts where the tunnel would go before I started anything with the tunnel. And this part of it, making sure I had all the clearances right, critical step. Now on some of my previous layouts I had used wire screen way back in the day and the cardboard method, and I wanted to try styrofoam. This was the first time I used styrofoam construction, and I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to do this, but number one, I wanted to make sure all of the surfaces that you could see inside as you looked into a tunnel portal either they were flat black or they were bricked like the portals are. I didn't want to look inside and see a wall, so painting that black was part one. And I bought this construction foam and I just started working with it and randomly cutting chunks of it just to make a giant piece. Now the idea was I wanted to be able to pick the mountain up, take it down into my workshop and detail it. It would be a lot easier to detail it in my workshop than it would be up on the layout. Now with the tools and the Dremel tools and the knives. And as it turned out, this turned out to be a good way for me to do it, since this layout is in the attic of my house and it's just easier to work in a workshop. I don't have a workshop right near the layout like a lot of people do if you have a cellar layout. So getting the layers of this in place and just tack gluing it together with home construction glue, this made me get a little vision of how I wanted that mountain to blend in. Now this room is an extremely odd shaped room, and I wanted to take advantage of the fact that the mountain on each end of the room I really put a lot of time and effort into thinking I wanted the train to come out of a mountain, just like you see a train in real life, go down a straightaway and then go into another mountain. I didn't want to have it look like it was a loop, and that was what I was trying to avoid, was that look that a train would just go around a loop. Now I tried a lot of ways. This is over a vacuum bench, a jet vacuum bench. So by carving it, and you could use an X-Acto knife, a hot knife, but this is the part of it that really took a lot of time, and I wanted to get it as close as I could before I put any plaster on it, plaster of Paris. And having a Dremel tool, and because I built model planes in the shop for my whole lifetime, This was relatively easy. Well, I have all the tools in place, and had I done this up by the layout, the dust and the mess would be just unbelievable. So having it down in my workshop was a giant help. And the tunnels are one of the focal points of the whole layout, so I wanted this to be exactly how I had in mind. And I had a picture in my mind of how I wanted it to be, that the trains would come out of the tunnel and go either around half of the layout or go back into another tunnel, just the way you would see a train go by in real life. So roughing it all out into chunks and then taking the chunks down into the workshop, that seemed like it was going to be the best way to do this. And these tunnels have to conceal the fact that I have angled ceilings and the dormer in the house. It's a very, very difficult room to envision unless you see it in real life. But every step of the way, I just was working on this, on the tunnels, and thinking back how I wanted this to look in the final product, and back and forth and back and forth. And after many, many trips up and down the stairs, I finally had something that looked remotely like what I wanted it to look like. Now, after adding several of the layers, and you can see how it goes right up into the corner, and I knew I'd want the top to be relatively flat so I could plant some trees, and that would make it just a little bit more realistic. But all of the internal work and these tracks are ballasted all the way through the tunnel too. When I did the final ballasting, I wanted to have the ballast go as far into the tunnel as I possibly could get it. I didn't want to have it just stop right at the tunnel portal. So having had some of the tracks laid out now and having these in place, now I really got to a watershed moment that I really wanted to detail these out as much as possible. Now, I used up all the scraps I could. There was almost no scraps at all on this. By the time I was done, I used them up on other scenery parts. The styrofoam is really easy to work with, the pink foam, and cutting it and shaping it and making a base for the plaster, just one of the jobs that I really didn't want to skimp on. And once I painted on a layer of plaster of Paris, and I could finally take the rock carvings. Now, I had some actual rock carvings that I made rubber molds from, so I could insert the rocks right into the wet plaster, and that kind of worked out good because the edge I wanted to have detailed, and this is something that I'd done on previous layouts, so it wasn't new, and I had plenty of scenicking material, but I wanted that mountain to be that I could just bring it up to the layout and drop it right in place. That was my original vision of how I wanted to do this. And it actually worked out pretty good with all the detailing and doing all the plaster work away from the layout. What happens is you don't have to worry about getting any on the tracks or having a problem. And so what this became is a piece that had a lot of the detailing on it, a lot of the work of doing it, and I could just take it up and glue it in place on the layout. And that, as a way of building a mountain, that way really worked well, and I did it, of course, for both ends of the layout. Now, looking back, I just think that was one of the better decisions I made, was to make these mountains, and I made two of them, one for each corner of the layout, but making them and detailing them off the layout so they could just be plug-in parts. And actually, one of the things that would happen here, if I wanted to change the layout significantly, add a mountain, take a mountain away, removing them in the final process would be just getting a knife underneath them and taking them away. Now, doing the backdrops, I started doing that, and I did it over so many times because all these walls are on an angle, so it never looked right to me. And I had my late friend George Venturini come up and critique it and give me some ideas, but I had help from my Baltimore Oriole. My pet Baltimore Oriole was up there helping me every step of the way. His name is Chicky, and what good company he was. But now you can start to see how this layout, I just changed the backdrop so many times. I had to deal with, there's a light switch right in the wall, and I needed to conceal that, and that of course is a whole separate job. I wanted to make the mountains as realistic as possible, and again, I did do it laying on my back on the layout like Michelangelo, and it took a lot of time and a lot of paint too. But getting the second mountain in place, once I got to that mountain in place and I had the track work pretty much laid out the way I'd want it, I was happy with it, except for the track work and the layout of things in a peninsula that goes into the dormer. But that changed over the 26 years of the layout. That changed many times. I changed the switching, I changed the track, I built the passenger station back there. But this, because this is actually 26 years ago, looking back, I remember the day I first could run the train through the tunnels, and they started to look realistic, even though I hadn't added trees yet. But I was doing one little piece of the layout at a time and making sure I got all the detailing in before I moved away. Now, what it is, I tried to do the scenery in a way that, and it's for anybody that's built a layout that doesn't have a lot of access hatches will understand. You start at the wall and work your way off the layout. And I wanted to see how it was going to look. I wasn't happy really with the peninsula. That kind of was a hokey track plan, but I knew I'd change it eventually. But just getting that I could run trains every night, that made it a lot easier to deal with. I had to bury the windows. I made kind of a backsplash for the windows. I had a lot of old Lionel trains in my collection. I probably had hundreds of Lionel trains, and I had Teflon tubs in them, and the cars, the old cars, old passenger cars. And I wanted to make the layout so that I could always run my old Lionel trains as well as the new ones. And this was such an important thing to me that I didn't paint myself into a corner that the only thing I could use is the modern trains. I wanted to be able to use them both. And that was a challenge for me, because in the beginning I thought this was going to be a lot more plug and play than it was, but the wiring went a lot longer than I thought it would, and the scenery, especially the tunnels. But boy, those tunnels add so much, I guess a focal point is the right word, to the layout. And I loved looking at the trains, and I'm so happy that I did this in a methodical, step-by-step way over many years, and shot some video of it along the way, because this brings back memories for me of 26 years ago, and having my friends come over. Mike Estella used to come over with his collection of trains, and we would just, Arnie Haber, we would just run the trains. Even though the layout wasn't finished, it was a lot of enjoyment, and we ate a lot of pizzas. But then as I could see the train going into the scenic part of the layout, I said, I have to finish the scenery on this layout. And that consumed many, many, many hours of planning and of changing, and until the final product that I have in the layout 26 years later. But even that I have changed on a regular basis as I add things, as I add detailing. It's always a work in progress. Now, all the modern scenicking products that I use, and from the trees to the shrubbery to the paint, every one of them, this was one of the most enjoyable parts of the whole layout, doing this, I call it the scenic detailing. And I did it in pieces. Now, I don't know how else to do it that would make sense, but getting that mountain, that it just could be a plug-in part, and getting the mountain down at the other end, now I had a little bit of a vision of how the rest of the layout would be finalized. And looking at how this played out years later, as I look at it, I think, all the rock work in the back, I didn't know how that was going to work out. I had chunks of plaster, and just that were made in rubber molds with rock, the fascia, connecting the plastered parts to the tunnel portal. And in the end, all the little detailing and painting the backdrops. And I love the fact that while I was building the layout, I bothered to shoot all this video, because to me, these are priceless memories. And I remember every one of the little steps of adding the lichen, adding the trees, going to train shows with my late friend Arnie Haber, who we would come back with box after box of scenic stuff, and looking for ideas on other people's layouts. We went to visit some of Arnie's friends who had very detailed, beautiful layouts. Arnie had a very nice layout in a private extension to his house. that to this day I think, wow, what a beautiful layout that was. And just always wanting to make the layout just a little more detailed, a little nicer, and being able to change it. Adding the tree line in the front was one thing. Adding the little rocks around the edge so that the tunnel kind of made sense, that there was a mountainous area there. Every one of the little steps, as I look back at the video, every one of the little steps was just added a nice dimension to the layouts and running the trains. Now, I built this facade to cover the windows, and one of the things I wanted to do is add some rock features to what was a piece of flat sheetrock. And on one side, it's like you're inside a mountain area, and I wanted to add that to the other side also. And so it would kind of match, so that when you were in the middle of looking down at the layout, you would see that there's the one side, and it kind of made sense that you were in a rocky, mountainous area of the country. I just didn't want it to go from being Florida to the North Pole in one step. And constantly being able to change it. You know, I don't know a good analogy for it, but doing the ballast. When I started doing the ballast, that got to be a very labor-intensive part of the job. But again, enjoyable. Now I've scenicked around the ballast, but I still have the whole middle of the table to do. And then it was time to figure out about I had a lot of choices of switch machines. I decided to do Del Air, put the compressor and the tank under the table. I had never used Del Air or Ross switches in the past. The cabinet that was in the room, we took the cabinet down, and this is pretty funny, made underneath the table the cabinet. Everything that was in storage in that cabinet went under the train layout in a very nice way. So it was a win-win on that one. But looking back, doing this little landscaping stuff, this was really a lot of fun. And a lot of people don't enjoy this. In fact, I've had people comment on the videos that I post of the layout running that why bother doing any of this scenicking? They just like to see the trains run. And I notice a lot of people do. And of course, we could still be friends, but I like having the layout detailed, and I enjoy doing it. And the Del Air, I had never used this before, so I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to play out. 26 years later, it's just like the day I installed it. Nothing wore out, nothing got deteriorated in any way. And it was really pretty easy to install the little compressor pieces that go under the table, and then all the tubing that goes to the switch machines. I found it relatively easy to do anyway, and it's been reliable. Now the next thing is, on my original concept sketches, I had 3 lakes. I wanted these lakes to be like about an inch deep, and I decided, and after thinking about how to do it, I decided to router out the plywood, not cut it totally through. And I wanted to fill it with epoxy, the material that they were selling at the time. And when I got done doing a couple little experiments using the material and looking at how this was going to play out, I wanted it to be, I said, you know what's going to happen? I want the trains to reflect in that lake. And as it played out, when I got done doing all the scenicking and then putting that final layer of epoxy in, after the bottom had already been scenic and I had rocks on the bottom and different tones of green and blue, as I'm looking back, I'm just wondering, what could I have done it any differently? I don't know. But the way this worked out, it worked out just perfectly for me. And I was really, really happy. Now with the final epoxy in there, you can kind of see how the train looked as it was going by. I really thought that was kind of nice. I like that. Now, there's a million other little scenery details in this. I don't want this video to get way too long. This is going to be the end of part 2, but there's going to be another part 3 where I did a lot of the other scenery work. And let's run the trains in the time we are right now. And we post on our channel the final layout, but the layout never really is finished, but this is where it is as of today. I hope you did enjoy the video running the trains. That train layout has been part of my life for over 25 years. I do enjoy railroading. I enjoy aviation. I enjoy model airplanes. It just seems like there's just not enough time to do everything in life. But there are 3,000 videos out on the channel you're watching now, Wendy Ertnowski or Wendy U. And of all the things out there, I guess the majority are motorcycling related things. If you have an interest in motorcycling, you might want to check out other videos. We just made a trip to France. Actually, we've done a lot of traveling. And guys, one and all, thank you so much for supporting the channel and for watching this video.